Hi, welcome back to the Discipler Group season. I hope you've had a great summer. I know Beverly and I spent some time away and just enjoyed time together, and then our family came and joined us, and it was really a wonderful time just to relax and to refresh and rejuvenate. So I pray that this summer has offered you some of those same opportunities as well. If not, I hope you're getting some time this fall. You know, Sabbath is really an important time for us. It's a time to reconnect with God, with creation, with one another. And those reconnections are so important for our vital ministry. So we're back to another Discipler season, and we look forward to a great year as we come together. This first series, we're going to be focusing on worship. Worship is one of the key aspects of our ministry together. And we've been doing a lot in terms of worship and through our Prodigal Worship series and teaching and talking about worship. The Call to Action study said that worship is one of the key drivers of vitality in a congregation. They said that looking at congregations that were highly vital, they found that they had inspiring worship, that these worship services were capturing the minds and imaginations of people. They also said that preaching helped to stimulate people's, stimulate people's souls, and also that the preaching also called people to action or called them to some sort of change. And so we're going to be working with you around worship to continually develop our worship services so that they touch the hearts and the minds of the people we serve. Today's lesson on growing your church by starting a new worship service is presented by Andy Lunt, Director of Congregational Development here in the Baltimore-Washington Conference. For over 30 years, Andy grew worship attendance at the Glenmar Church from 50 to 700 worshipers. During that time, he started 7 new worship services. Today, he shares practical tips on when, why, and how to start a new worship service. Consider these tips and tools as you develop strategy for potential new worship services in your congregations. Again, thanks for coming. We look forward to working with you. May God continue to bless you and your ministry.
Research has shown that the best way to reach new people for Christ is to start new faith communities. But that same research also shows that the second best way to reach new people is to start new worship services. Dr. Charles Arnn, president of Church Growth Incorporated, says that in his judgment, more than half the 300,000 churches in the United States could benefit from starting a new worship service. Arnn says that of the churches that do begin a new service, 8 out of 10 will experience measurable increases in total worship attendance, total giving, and in the number of new believers. As if that weren't enough reason to begin new worship services, new services are also better able to reach the unchurched, to reach those people who for whatever reason have not come into a church previously. New services give an opportunity to minister to more Christians, to people who aren't attending those services currently being offered. New services are better able to reach new kinds of people, the kinds of people who are not currently involved in a church in your community. And new services can help congregations break out of their normal life cycle. Like all living organisms, congregations have a life cycle. They're born, they grow, they mature, and they decline toward death. A number of things can change that pattern. A new pastor, moving to a new location, planting a new church, or starting a new worship service can be a way of helping a congregation to start growing again. New services allow for change while retaining the familiar, rather than trying to tweak existing services or to combine services to make something that is pleasing to those who prefer both contemporary and traditional, which usually ends up alienating everyone. A new service gives the opportunity to retain the familiar worship that people are accustomed to and bring change into the life of the congregation. And new services also have the benefit of being able to activate inactive members, those people who haven't come back to church because they thought it would be so conspicuous when they came back, and everyone would notice that they hadn't been there for a while. So for all those reasons, starting new worship services is a way to help your church grow. And actually, starting a new worship service has more to do with the outreach and evangelism ministry of your congregation than it does with worship, because it's a way to reach new people for Christ. Now, there are some times when it's wise not to add a new worship service. One time when it would be probably not the best idea to start a new service is if your congregation's top priority is caring for each other with an inward focus. In a case like that, bringing new people in would be too threatening to the congregation, and they would probably resist a new service for that reason. So what needs to happen in that case is there needs to be some work to change what might be called the culture of the congregation, so that the congregation grows to become more outwardly focused in order to better support a new worship service and better welcome the new people whom a new service would bring in. Probably not a good idea to start a new worship service during that last year of a lead pastor. If the lead pastor plans to leave within 1 year, it's probably best to wait and start the new service under the leadership of the new pastor, so there's some continuity. It's obviously perhaps not a good idea to start a new service just because you like the idea of starting a new worship, or because you like contemporary worship, or because everyone else is doing it. New services are for new people. And so the way to approach beginning a new service is to think about those new people who are going to be there and not just fall in love with your own idea of what you'd like to see. Now, there are some times when it's especially helpful and especially important to add a new worship service. One is when attendance is growing, when attendance regularly fills 80 to 100% of the seating capacity of your worship center. Studies have shown that when the pews and the parking lot are consistently filled at the 80% or greater level, that discourages new people from attending. It's also wise to start a new service when attendance is declining. That's a sign of that decline in the life cycle of the congregation, and something needs to happen to break that cycle, to give a new start, a new impetus for growth, and starting a new worship service can do that. It's helpful to start a new service when you're seeking to reach people who are not there. If you use Mission Insight to discover who the people are in your community and discover that there are large pockets of people who aren't there, one way to reach them is to start a new worship service specifically designed for them, their needs, their values. It's also important to start a new service when the surrounding community, the community around the church, is growing and the church is not. It would be helpful to begin a new worship service as an easier point of entry for some of those new people who are moving into the community. Trying something different can be a challenge for some congregations, but there are some very good reasons to take the risk to start a new worship service, even if it may be something that your congregation has never done before. Starting a new service helps the congregation to focus on those who are not yet there. Some congregations have become very inwardly focused, and as we help them to see the biblical mandate to go into the world, one of the ways to help them actually live that out is to begin a new worship service designed for people who aren't yet in the church. Starting a new service has challenged the leaders to convey the core message of the gospel in fresh ways. The message doesn't change, the gospel doesn't change, but the way it's communicated in order to better reach people who live in our communities today can and must change. Starting a new worship service makes it easier for people to invite their neighbors and friends. They can say to their friends, "We have a new service. I think you'd enjoy it. Why don't you come and try it out with us?" There probably is a reason that your members of your congregation haven't invited their neighbors and friends to the existing worship services. Maybe they're not all that keen on inviting their neighbors and friends to a service that they think might not be attractive or appealing or helpful for them. And so starting a new service can make it easier for people to invite their neighbors and friends. Starting a new service provides choices for people who are used to them. The mom and pop hardware stores and the mom and pop video stores have gone away, and they've been replaced by the big box stores that offer something for everyone. And while all of our churches are not large, we can do what we can in our particular context to provide the kinds of choices that people are used to. Choices in videos, choices in books, choices in hardware, choices in worship. And as we've already said, starting a new service may help activate some inactive members. Lots of good reasons to start a new worship service in your congregation for the people of your community. Now, one of the things that's important to keep in mind is the importance of critical mass, of making sure that there are enough people in that first service to sustain the service through the first months. Alice Mann of the Alban Institute, in a book called The In-Between Church, observes that the worst way to launch a new worship service is to start small and hope it will grow. We said early on that starting new worship services is a lot like starting new faith communities, and both share some of the common mistakes. And one of the 10 most common mistakes made in new church starts is launching too soon. Well, that can be true of new worship services as well. Don't launch too soon before all the planning and the publicity and the preparation have been made. Many, if not most, new worship services will decline 20 to 50% in attendance over the first few months. And so you need to have a critical mass up front that will sustain you through that time. And don't panic when that happens. It's natural. People come out at first because of the novelty. They come because they want to support the service, but they're not in it for the long haul. So you need to start at a level that can sustain that 20 to 50% drop that's normal over the first few months while the service continues to grow a more stable base. So because of that, it's best when starting a new service to aim for an initial attendance, to know that at that first worship service you're going to have the larger of at least 50 people, or if you're a larger congregation, at least 35% of your largest present service. So if you had a worship service that has the average attendance of 200, you'd want 70 people, 35% of 200, in your first new worship service. Now, one of the things that can be really helpful, and really ought to be a rule of thumb, is to make sure that of those attending that first service, about a third of them ought to be people who are unchurched. Don't try to put the total burden on people who you're drawing away from your other services. But if this is a service for people who are not yet in the church, then let's reach out and try to bring them in and make them part of the planning and the initial attendance at the first service. No matter what number you settle on for your first service, one of the keys is to make sure that the meeting room in which you worship should be filled to at least 50% capacity. So don't put 50 people in your 350-seat sanctuary, because it's going to look empty no matter what you do, and it's not going to encourage people with a feeling of warmth and community to come back. So here are some things to keep in mind. Here are some steps as we look at starting a new worship service that can reach new people for Christ in your community. Step number one, the most important step of all, start praying. One of the most underutilized resources for the church is prayer. Enlist a prayer support team in your congregation whose role is to pray for this new service and the people who will attend it. Ask the whole congregation to pray. Many people will not want to be involved in the effort to start a new service. They might even have some reservations about the new service, but it's hard for them to turn down a request to pray for the success of this new service in reaching new people for Christ. As you pray, pray primarily for discernment and God's direction. You know, we're all too ready in our ministries to devise our grand plans and then ask God to bless them. But if we pray for discernment and God's direction, what that does is enable us to discover where God is already at work in the congregation and already at work in the community, and then to get on board with that. Rather than asking God to bless our plan, we get with God's plan, because when we do, we know that God will always supply whatever it takes to do what God is calling us to do. Pray. Get the congregation to pray. Pray without ceasing. That is the important first, absolutely imperative step for starting a new worship service. Now, there are actually 3 phases in starting a new worship service. And the first phase is the planning. And for that, you will want to enlist a core team. Doesn't need to be a lot of people. In fact, it shouldn't be a large group. The ideal would be 5 to 7, 6 to 8 people. Look for those people who are spirit-driven People who are excited about reaching new people for Christ and who work well in teams because they're going to be spending a lot of time together. Look for people who don't have a turf to protect, who are not looking to feather their own nest or to enhance their own area of ministry, but really have a heart for helping your congregation reach out to new people. In that core team, you can begin to consider how a new service fulfills your congregation's mission. Many of our churches are already trying to do too many things, and adding a new worship service just seems like one more burden. But a lot of the things we're doing, quite frankly, don't fulfill the mission of the congregation. So this is really a question to ask about any ministry, but especially to ask about a new worship service. How does this new service fulfill your congregation's mission? Now the next step, and this is a really important step, is to, well, I'm going to use a big word here, is to exegete your community. You know how when we're preparing to preach, we exegete the scriptures, see what's there. Exegeting the community is seeing who's out there, discovering who's there in your community, especially who's out there in large numbers who aren't coming in to worship, who don't have a faith life, who haven't experienced the love of God in Jesus Christ. That's a really important step. Now, if you haven't, you can use Mission Insight, a very helpful tool to discover who the people are in your community and even where they live. And that can help you to exegete your community and know who the people are who are out there. And then that gives you the opportunity in your core team to determine the mission and the purpose for this particular worship service. Really, the mission and purpose is simply another way of saying, who do you want to reach and why? And it's at that point then that you can begin to identify things like what time this worship service will take place, where it will occur, and what style of worship it might be. Now, there are a number of things to keep in mind here. There is no one-size-fits-all in congregations and for reaching people in the community. But the call to action has uncovered 4 characteristics that are more common in vital congregations, and these would be important to keep in mind as you're looking for the style of worship for a new service that your congregation is beginning. The 4 things that the call to action has found are more common in vital congregations are a mix of worship styles. A congregation that offers both traditional and contemporary worship styles. So if you already have contemporary, you might want to start a traditional service. If you already have traditional, you might want to start a contemporary service. In addition to a mix of worship styles, the call to action has found that vital congregations typically use more topical sermon series, less lectionary preaching. Vital congregations use more contemporary music, and they make more use of multimedia. Some things to bear in mind as you begin to plan a new service for your congregation. These are things that are associated with vital congregations today. Then, when you've begun to answer those questions, you can look at some of the more practical details of developing a working budget and determining how the funding for this service is going to take place. And it's at that point, after you have the mission and the purpose, who you want to reach and why, and you've determined what type of service and when and where, then, and the budget and the funding, that's when you begin to share the plans with the church council and the leaders and the staff. That's so that you have some definite plans to share with the church council and with the leaders in the congregation, not just a vague idea which is all too easy for them to shoot down. The second phase in starting a new worship service is publicizing, and this is a really important phase as well. If we're planning this service primarily for people who are not yet in the church, that determines the best ways to communicate it. Obviously, we want to communicate it to our own members, so we'll use the internal means of communication, newsletters and announcements and our website. But ask yourself, who do you want to reach, and what means of communication are best able to reach them? Most new people coming to churches today say that they go first to the church's website. And so you'll want to make sure that, number one, that you have a website, an attractive website, a user-friendly website, one that conveys to people who aren't yet part of your church what it is that you want them to know, that will help them answer the question, why should they come to worship at your church? Don't overlook the social media, a Facebook page, Twitter, Use the young people in your congregation, especially if you're trying to reach young adults, which many congregations are trying to do today. Social media are an essential, absolutely essential tool. And then there are other ways that you may come up with that are unique to your community to get the word out that your church is starting a new worship service. But the key is, who do you want to reach? Communicate in ways that get the information to them. And then in the publicity phase of beginning a new service, the second thing you'll want to begin to do is to begin to network in the community. Work the networks that are out there. Get your members to talk with their co-workers, with their neighbors, with their friends, with people at the community pool, around the soccer field, and all of the places that people gather so that there's a buzz that gets created because people are drawn to something new. People are drawn to a new church, but people are drawn as well to a new worship service. So get the congregation, and especially the leaders and your core team, networking in the community among the people with whom they are accustomed to gathering to talk about the new service. Develop a community outreach strategy, a way of reaching out there to new people. Now, my colleague, William Cheney, talks about planning events of 3 different kinds. He talks about fish net events, fishing bucket events, and fishing pole events. A fish net event, you know, is something where you just throw the net out and you gather in everybody who's there. Well, that'd be something like planning and hosting a 4th of July picnic, or a fireworks night, or a time for families to come together to watch a movie. A fishing bucket, or as William says, a crab trap event, is a way of reaching more targeted groups. And then the fishing pole is something that you use to reach specific individuals. Now, some of the things that you might want to do in your community. For instance, a lot of elementary schools make it possible, have policies that make it possible for churches to send home announcements in students' backpacks. That would be a way, especially if you're trying to mount a service, to create a service to reach families with young children. You might want to hold a coffee hour at the local Starbucks or the bagel shop or something. Some churches have done this very successfully, where you agree to pay for the cup of coffee that people get that morning. And as they get their cup of coffee, the person handing it to them says, this is free. It's a gift from this church that's starting a new worship service. And you might even have a few of your core team sitting around to talk to people who will naturally ask, what? A free cup of coffee? How unusual is that? You might want to do some things for the teachers who are coming back to school, maybe providing a breakfast for the teachers during that week before the students come, and help them to get an idea of what's going on at your church. You might want to make use of the gatherings at the soccer field or other community events. Be creative. Reach out into the community. Try to share with those whom you're trying to bring into the church a vision of what this new worship service can be like. And then the third phase in planning, which you thought we'd never get to probably, is putting it together. See, the key is we often try to start at the end. We try to start with putting together a worship service and then hope somebody comes. And a lot of great worship services happen with nobody in attendance, because we haven't done the earlier work of determining the mission and the purpose. Who do we want to reach? We haven't done the publicity of getting the word out to the people we want to bring in. And so only after those are done do we then begin to actually put the service together. And the beginning of a new worship service makes the most impact if it's coupled with a comprehensive strategy. What that means is, what are you going to do with the people who come to this new worship service the other 6 days of the week? Do you have anything ready for them to study to help grow their faith? Do you have things ready to receive and to disciple their children and their youth? We need to think of a strategy that goes beyond just the service itself. Obviously, we'll need to identify and recruit and provide training for the teams that will be needed to put the service together. The worship team, the hospitality team, the tech team, the folks who will do childcare, and those who will follow up and make contact within that first week of new people who come to the worship service. But all of those are a part of putting the service together so that it will reach the people who are a part of the mission and purpose. And there's also a need to acquire all the stuff needed to support worship. If it's a new style of worship, you may not have the kinds of equipment that are required. You may need to purchase some technical equipment. You may be able to beg, borrow, or, well, I wouldn't encourage you to steal, but to beg or borrow some of this equipment from neighboring congregations, other United Methodist congregations, or those of other denominations who have been a little further down the road. But there's a number of things that you'll need to support the worship service, and it's important to have those in place before that first service. And then when everything is in place, the really exciting time, determine and communicate the launch date. When is it that you are going to offer for the first time this worship service to the community? You might want to have some soft openings, that is, where you just have a small team to try things out, especially to try out the technical aspects of worship. But then finally, the time has come to launch the service. Now, you may have already observed this, but this is not something that's going to happen in a week or 2 weeks or even 2 or 3 months. Planning a new worship service, preparing for a new worship service takes time if it's going to be successful. It's not unusual for this to take 6, 12, or 18 months. But if it's done well, it's worth the time and the effort because, remember, the second best way of reaching new people for Christ is to start a new worship service. And undergirding it all, and the last thing to keep in mind as you're putting the worship service together, is to keep praying. Prayer was the first step. Prayer is the last step. Prayer is the eternal step in implementing and in sustaining a worship service or any ministry that we engage in to try to reach new people for Christ and to grow our congregations. Thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure to share with you today.